Day 4 of the state's case against Vallow Daybell brought more evidence, kind of tying a lot of those loose ends together. Of course, Erica was inside the courtroom and is going to help take us inside the courtroom tonight as we piece together exactly what happened all day long. So we started with a continuation of Pillar, right? This investigator who has been on the stand. He was on the stand yesterday. So we continued looking at some of this evidence that they collected. What were the big revelations this morning?
Well, Andrea, as you said, it was, a pretty jam-packed day, and we find out at the end of the day that the state only has one more witness left. So we're really moving along here. But of course, this is the case. Lori-Vallow Daybell is accused of conspiring to kill her niece's ex-husband, and this is her third trial in as many years. She's already been convicted in Idaho for killing her children, Tylee and JJ, and she's also been convicted in Arizona for conspiring to kill her former husband, Charles Vallow. And, as we get through our show tonight, we're going to be breaking down sort of the timeline for you guys and how some of this investigation really truncates and fits into the other cases that we've covered over the past 5+ years. But as you said, Andrea, we start with what's in front of us today, and that was the cross-examination of Detective Brian Pillar. He is the case agent here in Gilbert. He is detective on the case, and he spent a lot of the day yesterday testifying for the state, and Vallow Daybell started her cross-examination, then got back this morning, and it felt like she was really taking a pretty tough stance with him. And, this isn't something not something unusual that we've seen in regards to how she maybe cross-examines investigators. And you always wonder what the jury thinks about that. But something interesting in all of this is that Lori's been advised time and time again not to open the door, to bring in some of her past, to keep that away from the jurors. And it seems that she keeps trying to bring in her niece, Melanie. And some quick backstory on her. She is Brandon Boudreaux's ex-wife, and after the shooting, when Detective Pillar was investigating, he had reached out to Brandon asking for any, financial materials, things like that could be related to possible financial gain if Brandon were to die for Melanie. So that's essentially the buildup here. But let's take you inside the courtroom so you can see how Lori-Vallow Daybell was questioning him.
Did you read those documents when they were sent to you?
I reviewed the documents that were sent to me, yes.
And did you include those in part of your investigation?
They are included in an investigation, yes.
So on those screenshots, does Melanie give a theory of what she thinks happened on October 2nd, 2019 that you reviewed?
Not that I remember from that exchange. I have to see it, but
Your Honor, I'm going to object to hearsay and relevance.
I'm not asking for the truth of the matter. I just want to know what he knows.
That doesn't ask for argument. You can show him the document and then rephrase your question.
Okay.
Is there something specific you would like?
Go ahead and rephrase your question.
Is this one of the screenshots that Brandon sent to you? That you reviewed?
It doesn't have any email headings or footers on it. This is what appears to be a Word document, like from Microsoft Word. I can't testify that this is exactly what he sent me, if this is a attachment to the email, from what I'm looking at here.
Okay. Do you recognize it as something that you've read before? The information.
I'm not reading the whole thing. I'm simply reviewing what I can to see if it's judgment. I must say that I don't remember this. There was a lot of correspondence shared and a lot of images. But looking at this seems familiar with some of the allegations that I've heard throughout the investigation. However, I don't remember this specific document being sent to me.
So when you requested Brandon Boudreaux on this date to send you these documents, that is part of the 7 screenshots that he sent to you.
Okay.
So my question is, during that time, you were still gathering information, right?
Yes.
You were still looking at all possibilities of what really happened on that day, right?
And I'm going to object to what time period are we talking about? February? Is there a date on there?
Clarify the time period.
Foundation.
Is it the February
12th?
email? February
Yes.
12th. All right. So rephrase the question with that in it.
So my question is, did you ever read the information in that screenshot that you have there before?
It is possible. If it was sent to me in an email, I likely read it, yes. But there was at the point of February 12th of 2020, there were other investigations I was working on as well.
So did you disregard the information in that during your investigation?
I'm going to object, and I think we may need to sidebar again.
Yeah, let's sidebar.
So that was about 5 minutes, and we play that out for you so that you get a good view of what the jury is sitting through as they try, as Lori, who's defending herself in this case, just as she did in her last case in Arizona, tries to use information that it appears Brandon had sent to the detective, maybe using Melanie, explaining why Melanie may have been involved. But as we have talked about so many times, not sure to what end. So, it seems like an incredibly painful process to sit there as Detective Pillar goes through this correspondence and tries to kind of jog his memory. And then it ends up eventually saying he doesn't, as you heard, I don't remember that this being exactly what I read. But here we are again with her bringing Melanie in, and she has talked several times before that that's not what she's going to do. She has told the state that she's not going to try to, imply that Melanie's the one responsible. And yet, here we are. So what was the point of that? And what comes out of it in the end? That's the thing that's very difficult to discern so often when we hear her cross-examine these witnesses.
Absolutely. And especially you heard just at the end there that they said, let's go into another sidebar. There were several sidebars this morning. And again, the jury is in there looking at this. And as you pointed out, Andrea, there were a lot of pauses as Detective Pillar is looking at this. I think everyone's kind of wondering, why is she going down this path, including the jurors, I would imagine, because again, she kind of inches her way down that way. And then ultimately after the sidebar, will come back with a different line of questioning. So it seems that whatever she's maybe trying to get out of whatever she wants to ask, it doesn't go very far and doesn't really drive home any point. And throughout the rest of the testimony, when she tries to bring up Melanie, there seemed to have been a situation, we understand that Brandon and Melanie are going through a divorce. And Lori at one point asks, well, did she come to you, asking for help? And Detective Pillar says, yeah, she came to me, but there was a custody issue regarding the children. So, I advised she go to an attorney. And Lori kind of sneaks in there. Well, she came to you for help, but you didn't think you could help her. And she's objected to, but of course you can't unring the bell. So the jury's, it's almost like she's trying to use the question, so to speak, to get her point across, because she knows she can't, take her questions that much further from this point as well. And I'll flag too, Andrea, that Melanie Boudreaux, formerly Melanie Boudreaux, now Melanie Pulowski, she is not facing any charges in this case, but understand that there still is an open case pertaining to all this that she could possibly be involved in. So again, no charges for her, but her name certainly comes up a lot. And we see her, being Lori, talk to Detective Pillar. We finally get away from Melanie and we start getting back into some of the same things that we heard about before in terms of questioning of Jeep color and different things and, the height of the Tesla and different things like that. And she really, really grills him in these moments. So we want to take you inside the courtroom again. Take a listen.
And having been a case agent hundreds of times, you must have known that if you were ever going to charge someone with this crime, then surely you would need this evidence so the defense could hire their own experts to do testing of the car and the window, right?
The crime of this caliber, and it's not uncommon for cases to develop into something more than what you initially believe, that's part of being human, part of being an investigator. We did not take the vehicle in this case. We did not have a decedent. In other words, we did not have a person who was injured or killed. We had property damage, and we were still very early in our investigation to determine what happened. So, no, we did not maintain custody of that vehicle.
So is it not in your protocol to preserve evidence?
It's in our protocol to preserve evidence.
But not in this case?
In this case, I made the decision not to maintain custody of that Tesla.
So without this evidence available, how would my experts be able to test for trajectory?
We couldn't test for trajectory with what we had. If it was here today, it's possible that you guys could test for trajectory with the advancements in technology. Again, not being somebody who is trained or certified in any type of trajectory training, I don't know how that process would even look, but we simply don't have the vehicle today as we're discussing this.
And you don't have an expert at Gilbert Police Department that's an expert in trajectory?
At that time, we did not.
Okay. And how would my ballistics expert be able to test the hole in the Tesla to determine, in fact, if it was a rifle or a handgun that was used? How would I do that now?
How would you go about?
How would I have an expert do that now?
You would hire somebody who would potentially be a specialist in this area and see if they had the ability to obtain evidence of trajectory. But how would you do that now outside of hiring somebody and doing that without the vehicle? I suppose you could not.
Is it possible to perform our own tests from pictures?
Tests? No.
And did you request any tests be performed on the Tesla itself?
Outside of trying to obtain the surveillance footage and do our best that we could with what we had for the bullet hole itself, no additional tests were made.
And no testing was done with the windows either. Is that correct?
You're referring to the glass that was?
Yes, the glass.
No other tests were done with the glass.
Okay. And how about the 4 pieces of the projectile that were found? Were any of those tested?
Tested for?
For what kind of bullet they came from or what kind of gun they came from.
Again, not being a munitions expert, but seeing what bullet fragments look like and what projectiles can turn into upon impact, those fragments could not determine any type of rifling, which is the marks that are made within a barrel when a weapon is shot, because the bullet was not intact, and we had no casing. We had no gun to verify where it came from. We simply had some markings of some possible jacketing and the lead, which appeared consistent with a bullet that was fired and then, of course, was fragmented. We were satisfied that he had a individual get shot at by some firearm, be it rifle, handgun, but a firearm, eastbound to westbound, that collided and then ultimately ended up in Mr. Boudreau's body frame. But to send it off for further testing, no, we did not send it off for further testing based on any reason that we knew we would not be able to get any viable weapon to compare it to, or any type of rifling where that would match another firearm.
So were you able to see, as he's testifying here, and of course she's trying to poke holes in this evidence that they have presented, and we've had multiple days of evidence about the trajectory and how they examined it, what they were looking for. Could you tell, does the jury seem to get restless during some of this very slow cross-examination, or do they seem to be listening intently? Can you get any read on that?
It's a combination of both, Andrea. And of course, we, can't talk to the jury at this point in time. We don't know exactly what they're thinking, but I've definitely seen some people rub their eyes. I saw a guy yawn at one point in time today, but then there are others who are looking intently, definitely taking notes. And after, we'll get to this in a moment, but the jury did have a few questions for Detective Pillar too. So I think that is a sign that they're paying attention. But yeah,
Sure.
it's tough because this is all the minutia of, we've heard so much testimony so far about where the bullet went and, where in the car it was and how the glass fell out of the car. And it is a bit painful maybe to sit and watch. And I think to me, the reason why, I wanted to play some of that is just maybe the tone she uses, like, well, how am I supposed to test this? And I think he came back, with a point saying, well, we couldn't glean anything from it. So why would you be able to glean anything from it? He made it sound like this was pretty typical in the investigation. But, and I think, the state, when they came back on rebuttal for redirect examination, they, really drove that point home too. And, the prosecutor, Trina Kay, really trying to illuminate for the jury that some of these questions that Vallow Daybell is asking really don't matter to some degree.
Right.
And her witness's testimony should be considered, good, solid, and it should help the case here. So let's take a look at some of that rebuttal here. Take a listen.
Did Brandon Boudreaux stop at the time of the shooting and put down a little ticky-tack marker and say, better note this for later so I can tell the detectives exactly where my vehicle was when I was shot?
No, he did not.
Did Brandon Boudreaux get out of his car and go over and mark the exact end of the Jeep so that you would know exactly where that was when he was shot?
No, he did not.
Did he go over and tell the person, whoa, I gotta wait and find out exactly how this rifle barrel is sticking out of the back of your Jeep so that later on they'll be able to document the height, the angle, if it's up, if it's down, if it's a little to the right or left, so that later on they'll be able to do some trajectory?
No.
So none of that happened?
None of that happened.
Were you surprised he didn't do that?
Not at all.
Setting that expectation that is not, to be expected. It's not what most people in the middle of a traumatic situation do, and kind of what Detective Pillar was trying to say even to the defendant of, we weren't going to test that. That's not what we would normally do. And I think he pointed out, right, we didn't have a death. We had property damage at this point. No one knows at this point in the investigation just how convoluted and complex that this case would become, or how it would be connected to many others, obviously. And so I think trying to drive home the fact that they did exactly what they would normally do, very routine, information that they're gathering, and that it wasn't a lack of care or a lack of good investigative work, and which is what she was trying to imply. And I think that became clear in that redirect, as you said.
Absolutely. And he also testified that, it's not unusual for this to happen, but also that Brandon Boudreaux, that was his only vehicle. So they were, looking at it conveniently. He said there's no decedent, meaning he didn't die. So it was routine, as you said, Andrea. And we mentioned that the jury had some questions for this witness after, and I'll walk through that quickly, but two of them related to Melanie. One of the jurors, they kind of broke it down into a couple questions, but asked, were the recordings with Melanie, or were the phone calls with Melanie recorded? It was disclosed during testimony today that Brandon tried to call her after the shooting. As we mentioned, they have shared children, and, at the time they were wanting to get a hold of her to let her know what had happened, and that, this impacts their family, of course. She did not answer, and Brandon left a voicemail for her, is what Detective Pillar testified to. And then Detective Pillar said he called her himself, left her a voicemail indicating he was a detective working on this case, and she should give him a call. And he said all of that was documented, recorded. And then she actually came to the police department and did an interview with him on October 3rd, the day after. And he said he talked to her for about an hour. That also was recorded, but we didn't see any of that here. So that's what the jury was thinking of a little bit. And then the bigger question, well, maybe not bigger, but another question that really, I think, drives in so many minutes of testimony and cross-examination is the color the Jeep color that Lori keeps asking
Right.
nearly every investigator about, all the different colors that maybe came up. And the jury asked, is it common to confuse colors? And Detective Pillar said, absolutely yes, especially when you're a witness, and particularly if there's a violent or an emotional situation. He said it's not
Right.
uncommon for people to mistake black for white or red for blue, which seem like totally polar opposite colors. But
Yeah.
I think we've seen that in other investigations too, that, eyewitnesses aren't always exact. And he
Very
said
true.
time and time
Yeah.
again, we were able to confirm the color based on photos from the Chandler investigation. So we didn't have to
Sure.
rely on all these different, accounts, so to speak.
Yeah, right. And we talked about that. I think we've talked about in the previous shows. Again, yeah, you see that commonly where people will, or they think they saw a weapon when there wasn't one, or, things, they will report very specific details that seem like, that you would absolutely know it's a black or white, no pun intended there with the color, but, like that you understand, like, this is what I'm seeing. If I see a black Jeep, right, it was actually a white van, does that mean the incident didn't happen? Investigators know that's not, that is not the way that works. We always want reliable information, of course, and that would be great. But that's just, as he said, I think, it's human nature, and it is not, that's not uncommon at all. And so I don't think that surprises jurors, especially if they've ever experienced any sort of incident where they had to remember something or recall some specific fact. I think most of us understand how that's not simple to do or not easy to do. And so I don't think that helps her. Again, doesn't seem to surprise anybody. I would be, I would imagine that that's not super surprising. Did he seem a little, like, listening to him, did he seem a little, maybe not frustrated, but did he seem to get worn out by some of the questioning?
Possibly. And again, Gilbert Police Department says they can't comment on anything. So we haven't had access to, speak with the Detective Pillar, but he's sitting in there day in, day out as the case agent. So we've seen him. He's been, privy to all of this, not just his own testimony. And again, can't speak for him, but I could imagine it gets exhausting when you are kind of going through things over and over again. And when you have someone like Lori, who is maybe asking a question in a way that wouldn't be typically asked by an attorney. So, we saw a few times, could you say this again? I don't know exactly what we're talking about, especially when she's trying to bring in her own documents. He's like, maybe I've seen this, but I don't know. And there's a few times where it's kind of like, okay, he's been asked this already. He says he doesn't know this, let's move on. But, he wasn't the only witness to take the stand this morning, Andrea. And we had a few more witnesses that really start to piece everything together. We mentioned yesterday with Detective Pillar, he brings up things like how they, pulled samples for gunshot residue testing and DNA testing, but we didn't have that, extra step to actually connect a dot there. And today we got that, as we suspected. So we heard from someone, a DNA expert, a forensic scientist, so to speak. Actually, that is their title, with the Mesa Police Department. They are the ones that do the DNA testing for the Gilbert Police Department. And what we essentially gleaned from that is that Alex Cox's DNA was found inside that Jeep Wrangler believed to be used in the crime. Same thing when we heard the gunshot residue guy come up. This is someone from I shouldn't say guy, this is someone from the Phoenix Police Department, also a forensic scientist, but it helps compartmentalize in my mind because we've had so many witnesses today. But when he just took the stand, he spoke to, again, some of the elements of collecting gunshot residue, what you're looking for. We heard a lot about lead. What are the things for lead, antimony, and barium? I'm obviously not a scientist, but I have it written down. So that's what you're looking for in those elements. And he kind of spoke to his processing and also confirmed that, in the back of that Jeep, either a firearm was discharged or something with GSR on it, that's gunshot residue, was inside the back of that Jeep. And, we saw some typical Lori cross-examination with that forensic scientist where she's asking, well, could it have been fertilizer? Could it have been hairspray? Could it have been, fireworks? And he says, well, maybe some of those things have some of those elements in it, but you need all three for gunshot residue. And that's exactly what the state circled back on. So what do you think about adding, those layers of evidence to this case day by day here, Andrea?
We said last night that that's what we expected. You get each piece, each witness gives their perspective and what they were directly involved in. So we did expect that to come together today, just as Trina Kay had laid out in her opening statements, that they did find Alex Cox's DNA in that Jeep. And so again, yes, the layers. I mean, it is. You can't unexplain it, and I guess it will be very interesting to see what kind of information, if Lori-Vallow Daybell presents witnesses, which could come as early as tomorrow. What kind of available information might she have to refute any of this? Meaning, I think that's again human nature, is to ask the question: is how does that happen? If this is not true, if he is not responsible, if she is not a part of this case, then how does this happen? And I think that's all of this information, all this evidence, very difficult to discount or very difficult to explain away. And so I think that, again, each piece just solidifies the prosecutor's case. I don't think we've heard anything or seen anything that felt anything other than very definitive. So I can't imagine that that's not helping the prosecution, helping the state.
Absolutely. And, early on when we were listening to the opening statements, and we're trying to be considerate of the jury who doesn't know any of these people, doesn't know the backstory, and how it can be so confusing to kind of have all these different characters introduced. And looking at this holistically, even though the state has had to call people maybe out of order in a way that they didn't want to, I think today was really a powerful day for them in terms of connecting all of these dots together. And I do think that as a juror, I do think it makes sense. What they have presented has made sense. And I think most of all, this was the last witness of the day. He's now a lieutenant with the Rexburg Police Department up in Idaho, your neck of the woods, Andrea. But this is Ray Hermosillo, and he's a familiar face and a familiar name in this whole Lori-Vallow Daybell world here. So run us through where he comes into play, and then we'll kind of walk through some of his testimony.
Yeah, you have to remember that Detective Hermosillo, of course, this is what's difficult for us. So we are now years removed from this, from all of this, all the story that we know about Lori-Vallow Daybell. And so Ray Hermosillo, what we know of him in Idaho is he really is the face of the investigation into JJ and Tylee, Lori-Vallow's two children, who we now know she has been convicted of helping to kill here in Idaho. Also, the wife of her current husband, her fifth husband, Chad Daybell, Tammy Daybell, also Lori-Vallow Daybell, convicted of conspiracy to commit her murder as well. But now remember that when Ray Hermosillo is called into this case, he doesn't know any of that yet. Tammy Daybell still alive. The children, no one is investigating at that point. No one's investigating them as being missing. However, this is just in the beginning of all of that, right? Just now, Kay Woodcook, we know, is starting to get suspicious. She has not seen JJ or Tylee since September. So, right, this is when, all these pieces are happening. But Ray Hermosillo here in Idaho didn't know any of that yet. So he's called in because of this Jeep. Right, they know that this Jeep has been involved in this shooting, and then as we heard in evidence, they had those license plate readers. So the Jeep is tracked to Idaho. They know that's where it's gone, and now Ray Hermosillo is called in to help, right, bring some of that, find that Jeep. That was his role in this case. Right, and now here he is. We've seen him testify multiple times, but here he is in this case again.
Absolutely. And, he is, to me, I think, the thread that ties this all together. We heard Detective Pillar with the Gilbert Police Department testify that they had to rely on other agencies here, especially because Lori and Alex, and we heard in testimony that Melanie Boudreau, were all living in Rexburg when this all unfolded. Yes. So again, just to walk back the timeline for everybody, this, the whole series of events that Lori-Vallow Daybell is either convicted for or is, being accused of currently in this last case here. This all started, there was buildup, but the first big crime that we know of is July 2019, when her former husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed by her brother. So from that point on, that's the Chandler Police Department here in Arizona. We know after his death that Lori and her brother move up to Idaho sometime between July and early September, I believe, is when they actually went up there.
Yes.
And those, it's September now that the investigators believe Tylee and JJ were killed. But as you said, Andrea, they weren't looking for that yet. We understand that maybe it was the end of November when police were really starting to piece together that, okay, the grandma is looking for JJ. We don't know. Wait, that's the same family as the Jeep. And this agency is looking at them for this shooting and that. So it's all started, percolating and coming together. And then as we get into that, we know Lori is arrested in Hawaii and brought back to Idaho. And, the kids are found in June, 5 years ago yesterday in Chad Daybell's backyard. And we kind of just see charge after charge unfold from there with Brandon Bujo's shooting attempt in October 2019 and the death of Tammy Daybell later in that month with Chad and Lori getting married in November. So I know that's a lot of things to piece together, but as you said, Andrea, this is all going on at the same time. And what's so interesting is that we know all of this sitting in the courtroom. The jury does not. And the state in this third trial here for Lori Vallow Daybell has to stay so focused on what is in front of them that some of this testimony that we're hearing from Ray Hermosillo, we've heard another edge of it before, we'll get into it in just a minute, but hearing some of this, I'm like, oh, that's when he was looking for this, and this. And we know he's testified, in Chad Daybell's trial about finding this in the townhome. And it's just interesting to see everything kind of fall into line like that. So that's really the whole backstory here. But what was it like to see his testimony today?
Well, you talk about the prosecution having to stay so focused. I actually think the challenge is for the witness themselves because, again, it's, so much information and all of these pieces. I think as a witness, it would be difficult for me to keep all of that very compartmentalized because it does tie together so much. So I think they do a tremendous job as well of making sure that they aren't implying anything else, or even with Brandon Boudreaux when he took the stand. I mean, all of these people who have had to talk about the incident, when it would be most natural to talk about Charles Vallow's death, things like that. That I think is really interesting. Yes, they are very careful, and so I think.
Well, and even sometimes
I look at that
going. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, even
good.
Looking at Pillar's, listening to Pillar's testimony. Sometimes when he's asked a question, he sits on it for a beat, because I think you have to, especially when you're wading into the territories of other investigations. And same with Lieutenant Hermosillo now, but detective at the time of the investigation. But and I think everyone did a very careful job, it felt like, because it's not the state that attempted to open any doors here. It was always Lori Vallow Daybell being cautioned to not open the door to bring in her past. But, let's get back into Ray Hermosillo's testimony. We kind of, he's looped into this with the Jeep. He talks about, actually, it was interesting finding the Jeep. They, were surveilling, the complex essentially. And if, we can paint a picture for people, Rexburg is in southeastern Idaho. I know it's a bit of a ways away from you guys in Boise and, of course, far away from us in Arizona, but I've actually been up there. We've been to this complex when we were doing some of our reporting, and it's, run of the mill, neighborhood. There's a lot of interconnected homes. And in some of the photos that were shown today, and again, the jury didn't have any questions about this, but you could see toys in front of, the home Alex Cox had, presumably something that maybe JJ would have been using because he did live there for a period of time. So it's just sad to kind of see some of these images come back up again. But he talked about essentially surveilling that area, keeping an eye out for this Jeep. They went over the course of a weekend, couldn't find it. And then he describes driving, coming home from the gym on the following Monday, seeing the Jeep and kind of, making a call and getting it towed so they could have, they could impound it. And he said they brought in the Gilbert Police Department. They executed the search warrant. That's where we got some of those DNA swabs and things like that. So he, again, solidifies the other testimony that we've heard from other investigators who say, here's how we got to this point. And, he really bring some of that in. But I think the more interesting stuff, Andrea, and as we said, we've kind of seen some other angles to this, is when they actually execute warrants on the homes of Lori, Alex, and Melanie. And it was interesting because they said Lori's townhome seemed essentially unlived in. Someone could have just moved in. There was nothing in it. But the one that Alex had rented, which Lori had been documented going in and out of, there was some stuff in there. It looked like people were living in there. Do you remember this testimony from before?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and I remember them talking about, specifically about Lori's apartment or Lori's home being, as if it had been vacated or that had never been lived in. They're not sure. So, but yes, and then all of what they found in Alex's possession.
Yes. So they kind of walk through, and Detective Hermosillo, or at the time he was Detective Hermosillo, says, you could tell someone was there. There was food, but when you go upstairs, there were no clothes. He said it looked like someone had kind of taken them and took off with them. But then they go into the garage, and we saw this come up today in images, and we see it's a bunch of seemingly Alex Cox's belongings. He said there were male clothes. His passport was found among them. There were tax documents, mail, other things that, had Alex's name on them. But then they continued on and actually found some weapons. Take a look.
You told us that you were looking for any types of weapons. So I have Exhibit 145. Did you see sort of a rifle and a case, and 146 showing that rifle?
Yes.
Do we see in 147 another case? And 148? And then 149 showing that rifle.
Correct.
What's this?
That's a scope.
Was there anything on any of these rifles that would indicate you could attach a silencer or anything onto the end?
Yes, there were a few rifles that had threaded barrels. In this photograph, you can see the difference. That is a threaded barrel that you could screw a silencer or suppressor on the end of a rifle.
Okay. And so we see sort of some close-up. This seemed to have its own, I guess, to give padding for the person using that.
Correct.
And then showing sort of the scope itself. Was there in that bag ammunition with that?
Yes, ma'am.
Were there boxes of ammunition?
Yes.
Was there all kinds of ammunition?
There was a lot of ammunition.
Were there extra rifle barrel parts?
Correct.
Were each of those laid out to be photographed, that of the rifles that were located?
Yes.
So we see in 156, is that one of the rifles that was located?
Yes.
157, was that one of the other rifles that was located?
Yes.
158, another rifle that was located?
Yes, ma'am.
And then 159, what do we see here and here? Are those extra parts?
Different uppers for rifles, correct.
Okay. So these could be changed out with the stock?
Yes.
So multiple firearms, and firearms that match, I guess, like the scope and the silencer that we have heard might have been used in this case, or in this shooting. So all of these pieces and parts. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, as we heard from Detective Pillar, they didn't have a way of knowing exactly. They didn't have a gun at the time, right, to be able to look at the specific. And they didn't have the casing. He talked about that, right? He didn't have a way of connecting a specific firearm with that ammunition. However,
that is what he said.
You now know that, right? Yeah. He had weapons.
Andrea, I had the same question, because I was like, well, they did have firearms. Could they have tested them? But
yes, right.
I think both Detective Pillar did a good job explaining that we just had these fragments, and it was really hard to connect a fragment to a gun that we didn't have on the scene.
Correct.
And because these guns were found, several weeks later after the shooting attempt at Brandon Boudreaux. And, it is interesting. I would have maybe, if I were a juror, that probably would have stood out to me, and maybe I would have followed up on that, just because, it wasn't very clear exactly why maybe they couldn't have gone back to bring this gun into the picture. Who knows? But, I think the whole point they were trying to make was that Alex Cox has guns like these, or at least they were found amongst his possessions. These seems to be things that are used when you have the duct tape, kind of the rest there. So it seemed like he was, actively maybe using some of this equipment. And we later learned from Detective Hermosillo that Alex Cox was going to a firing range in Idaho as well. So we do know that at least someone by his name or someone using part of his license plate, they were able to piece together too, that checked in at, essentially a shooting range. So we know that there was maybe some, there are connections here. Again, a lot of this was just put out there. And I think it's connecting the dots, not exactly, holding them all together in one piece, but that would be that. So I think it's all very compelling, but go ahead.
Yeah. No, even if circumstantial, again, this would be considered circumstantial evidence, meaning they don't have a specific tie directly from that weapon to this bullet hole or this shell casing and things like that. However, there are a lot of homes that you could go into, a lot of situations be very different if they had not been able to find any weapons that could have been used, right? That would be a huge hole. That would be something I think very much missing for a jury if we had no weapon found anywhere. But here we have, weapons that very easily could have been used in this shooting. And I think that's the kind of circumstantial evidence that we see that usually works very well for people.
Yeah, and this wasn't the only visual that the jury got this afternoon. We also get some surveillance footage from a storage unit in Idaho, which, again, we've seen these images in a different context when we're talking about the disappearance and deaths of Tylee and JJ. But, so it was interesting, again, to see this angle, this version of it. But essentially, the picture that Ray Hermosillo paints is that you see Lori go to and from this storage unit. You see her maybe renting the unit for the first time. And then over the course of, early October, when this shooting happened, you see her and Chad bring some stuff to the storage unit. And then we see Alex also take some stuff from the storage unit. So it's just interesting to kind of see this again come together in this specific context. And the something that we're talking about, Andrea, this might stick out to you, was they believe that Chad and Lori brought a Jeep tire, or a tire, I should say, not exactly a Jeep tire, and then the back seat of, a car back seat, essentially, bringing that into a storage unit on October 2nd. Why do you think that stands out?
Well, of course, these are the things that they say were missing from the Jeep that Tylee Ryan had driven, and that Lori Vallow had owned, had been in her possession. Right, those were the things that were missing from that Jeep during this incident. And so, of course, now we have potentially they're showing this is where they were.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting, especially because the images were a bit hard to see. I would say, at least from our vantage point, the footage that I've seen before, that I know we've used in newscasts, has been incredibly zoomed in. But Ray Hermosillo says just by having interactions, again, being very careful with his testimony, saying, I've had interactions with Lori Vallow. I know what she looks like. I know who she is. He says that's her, that's Chad Daybell, and that's Alex Cox. So it's all three of them are connected, again, to this storage unit that seemingly has some evidence in it. So take a listen.
The same day that we have someone in Gilbert, Arizona, firing a rifle out of the back window of a Jeep without a spare tire, we see Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell putting a tire and what could be a bench seat into a storage unit that Lori Vallow rented.
That's correct.
What do we see being taken out now?
That is a tire that he's carrying.
So the previous day we'd seen Chad Daybell rolling the tire in. Here we see Alex Cox carrying it out.
Correct.
The previous day we had seen Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell carrying in a object of similar size to a bench seat.
Correct.
And today we saw Alex Cox carrying that out.
By himself, correct.
How do you explain that? Right? This is another one of those layers that I think probably one of the most compelling pieces in this case, because lots of people, certainly lots of people in Idaho own weapons. Lots of people have rifles. But how many of us would have that specific, the moving a tire and a bench seat out of a vehicle, presumably? How often does that happen, on top of everything else at this specific time? I think that this is a huge piece. Probably, I would assume that that's a big piece in terms of bringing it all together for the jury as well.
Absolutely. And I think it stands out too because you have Lori on camera.
Right.
I feel like a lot of the
Yes.
evidence that we've seen so far, a lot of it falls almost directly on Alex. And
Sure.
it's been interesting that Lori hasn't really mentioned him very much at all in any way. You know, it's theoretical. She could have possibly said he just did it. I had nothing to do with it. I don't think that would have
Right.
landed, but she has not done that. I'll be very clear. And Alex Cox, who's since passed away, he was never charged in this because he died before charges were filed. So we'll be clear about that as well. So he can't testify or, defend himself, so to speak, in this case.
Sure.
But it does link her to this. And that is what you need in a
Right.
conspiracy case, is evidence linking her to the person who is believed to have committed the shooting attempt
Right.
in this case.
Well, and it would have been this and then those calls, the alibi, the calling the burner phone, and then her having Alex's phone during the time that this shooting happened, allegedly calling it and try to create this alibi. And so those are really the two pieces, the biggest pieces, I think, of evidence that draws her or that ties her directly to this and to her conspiracy in this.
Yeah. And later in the day, we heard Detective Hermosillo, now Lieutenant Hermosillo, testify that he, was able to get a warrant, had access to the Gmail accounts associated with numbers and names like Alex and Lori. And I do want to just, pull up my notes here because some of the things that both of them searched also stood out. And when we're talking about Alex, we'll start with the account linked to him at first. Of course, we don't have footage of him actually typing it into his phone or something like that. But again, an account connected to Alex Cox was searching for some of these things. Best projectiles for long range, where to shoot near Rexburg, window tinting, ballistic items, man shot in Gilbert, Arizona, news on Brandon Boudreaux. And I think maybe one of the most damning things that Hermosillo brought up is that they also got map data, and Alex Cox on October 1st, the night before the shooting, had searched Brandon Boudreaux's new address, and he also searched it again, or I should say the account searched it again the morning of the shooting before the shooting occurred. So that's evidence.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mapping it to, seeing where it was, presumably seeing where it was and how to get there, and maybe potentially even looking at, how to get in and out of the area. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Absolutely.
And then
very
Lori, she doesn't have the same extensive search, at least not presented in this case, but her account had searched how to get the back seat out of my Jeep, and then Gilbert News around the time of the shooting. So again, similar vein. These are things that, as you said, circumstantial, it all adds up when you put this together holistically.
Yes. Very much so. Yeah, absolutely. And Lori herself did not have any questions for Hermosillo. Was there any cross here?
No. I was just going to say that was really surprising. I think maybe one of the most surprising parts of the day, especially because she was so gung-ho on really, questioning most investigators who have taken a stand, particularly Detective Pillar, who, her cross-examination of him spanned into 2 days. So I was very surprised, especially because she and, the jury does not know, but she and Detective Hermosillo have history. He, presented a case, he was part of the case, the investigative case that she's been convicted of in Idaho. Same with Chad Daybell, who is, also convicted in this case, if we haven't mentioned it, now on Idaho's death row. So I was very surprised that she did not have any sort of cross-examination. But
maybe that is because of the history. There's something about that where it is difficult to look at somebody standing there, looking in their eyes. I understand. I'm again, I cannot put myself in her mindset. I cannot, begin to know exactly what she's thinking and feeling. But you almost have to wonder if there isn't so much that he knows, that it's difficult for her to have anything there, or that feels uncomfortable or awkward. I understand there are a lot of people who would say, I don't believe she feels uncomfortable or awkward about anything at this point. But it is very interesting to me that she had nothing to say or nothing to question him on. And that's really the one thing that is different is their history, I guess, is that extensive history that they have in all of these other investigations, where we now know, of course, that she has been convicted in heinous crimes. And so that's the one thing that is different about him. And I have to wonder if that didn't play a role in her decision.
Well, and I wonder too, Andrea, that, as you said, there she is with Chad bringing a tire
Yeah,
into a store.
right.
Like some of the stuff, how do you refute it? And I feel like a lot of her
Sure.
line of questioning when she comes up and talks to investigators, it's try and poke holes in things. And maybe
Yeah.
if she doesn't have anything to poke, she's not going to try. So again,
Right.
we are just speculating here ourselves. We do not
Sure.
know.
Right.
But yeah, you can't, she can't take it back. She can't say, just kidding, I want to ask him some questions. That's not going to happen because the state has indicated that Detective, now Lieutenant Hermosillo, was their second to last witness. We have one more on deck. This is an FBI special agent who, again, is someone we expect will continue to kind of tie everything up in a bow in how this case was presented. And we're expecting this agent to testify in the morning. The state will then rest. And then the judge advised Lori-Vallow Daybell, if you have anyone you're planning to call, have them ready tomorrow afternoon. So she didn't, looking at her, she didn't gauge one way or the other that she was planning to do that. We know from her last trial here in Arizona, she didn't call anybody, but she was a bit, she was a bit tight-lipped, we'll say, or kind of like, we'll see if I call somebody. She didn't, I think she had a weekend maybe to even think about it or give confirmation of what she was going to do. But we know that who she could call, if she could call anybody, is going to be a very short list and with very limited, scope and maybe what they could discuss. She can't just, call anybody she wants to talk about anything she wants, but she can. Probably won't take this option. She could take the stand herself, but then again, that opens her up to having to talk about her very, 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 very dark past.
Right, absolutely. I would be shocked if she did that. I will actually be surprised if she presents any witnesses. Of course, we know there is a process for that, and as you indicated, the people that in the hearings previous to this trial, leading up to this trial, any of the conversations that she's had, I think she does mention one expert witness that we don't even know for sure has been subpoenaed or compelled to be there in court for her or has agreed to do that. We don't have any of that information. But the other people she talked about were people that, as Alex Cox's widow, her sister-in-law, who was married to Alex Cox for a short time, I don't know what that relevance would be. I mean, I'd be surprised if she was able to bring some of these people that she discussed, all of them being friends or family, that, again, the state has been very clear on. I would be surprised if that wouldn't be a pretty big argument against those people for relevance. And so I'll be surprised. I will be surprised if she puts anybody on the stand.
Yeah, and it is interesting because, again, Alex Cox's widow, we know she's someone who has been interviewed by police in connection to these cases. We know Melanie Gibb is another name that comes up, not to be confused with her niece, Melanie. This is a friend, Melanie, who has testified in Idaho, I believe both Lori and Chad's trials there. And she was involved, again, in this religious, doomsday prepper group. And she, was a name that Lori had dropped in pretrial hearings. And again, the state objected at that point. What is the relevance of these people? Just because they've had information doesn't mean they have specific information related to this particular case. And I think that's why we know there are so many more players involved here. And I think, again, the state has been very intentional in keeping this very narrow, a pretty short witness list compared to what they could be calling and who they, could be bringing in, especially if, Lori opens the door, so to speak, to bring in more of her past, which has not fully happened at all during this trial. But I agree with you, Andrea. I don't think she's going to call anybody, but we'll see tomorrow. If in the event she does not call somebody, and I'll point out too that she doesn't have to. It is the state's burden of proof to prove that she is guilty here. So she's not doing, what she does or doesn't do shouldn't be, looked on by the jury in any specific way. That is an instruction given to the jury when they do deliberate. We know that both sides are reviewing jury instructions, so we know it's coming close. But if she doesn't call anybody, the judge said he intends to move forward with closing statements as soon as tomorrow. So the jury possibly could be getting the case tomorrow at the soonest, which I think this kind of flew by.
Yeah, and that actually may be a clue too, because if you remember when the defendant presented her opening statements, she mentioned something about that. I mean, she drew specific attention to the fact, and there was even an objection around it because of the way she worded it, that the prosecution has to prove 100% that I committed this crime. I think what she was intending to say was that the burden is on the prosecution. So perhaps that also was a little bit of a clue that she didn't intend to or didn't have a plan to launch, a defense in terms of presenting her own case or presenting it differently, and kind of another answer, if you will. And so that also might be a clue that she isn't planning on bringing anybody else. But certainly, once that time starts, we will of course be keeping a very close eye on what that jury does when they get the verdict. We, of course, we'll share that with everyone. I mean, when they get that case, and then how long it takes them to reach a verdict, because we always like to see how long that goes, and of course, compare that to other trials too.
Absolutely. And Andrea, before we go, I want to quickly point out, you mentioned Lori's family. We know her son, her oldest son, was in the courtroom today, Colby Ryan. We know he sat in her last trial here in Arizona on certain days. We weren't able to talk to him after the fact, but I did see at one point in time Lori turn around and smile in his direction. He came in while she was cross-examining Detective Pillar, so she didn't see him come in. He came in after things started today. We were able to kind of look at him in the courtroom. It was unclear, again, if she was looking at him. I couldn't tell, again, from being behind, whether Colby was looking at her, but I saw something similar the last time she noticed he was in the courtroom. And it's just interesting because he's spoken to media before about how he's lost essentially his entire family in this, including his mother, who's going to be serving the rest of her life in prison in Idaho. So he stood out in the courtroom. And then one other person I want to point out is Detective Nate Duncan. He was the case agent for the Chandler investigation. We've seen him come in and out. He actually testified in this case, but he sat in the courtroom today. And I noticed at one point in time it was him, and then we have Detective Pillar, who's sitting with the prosecution, and then Detective, now Lieutenant Hermosillo, on the stand. And it just, again, talking about how all these cases are interconnected, it felt like these investigators were just there to support one another, to be honest with you.
Right. Yeah, and have quite the history and quite the story to share. My goodness. Well, that's what we get to see inside the courtroom. Of course, we're so glad you were here with us tonight. And tomorrow, a big day, as we likely will see this case wrap up and potentially even go to the jury to make their decision. We'll let you know how that all unfolds tomorrow inside the courtroom. We'll see you then.